After losing everything, my son's wife looked me in the eye and called me a failure. 3 hours later, I was sitting alone in a freezing SUV with nowhere left to go. 71 years old and this is all you have? She had said as my last duffel bag landed on the driveway. My son stood only a few feet away and never said a word. The family I spent a lifetime building watched me leave like I was a problem they were finally done dealing with. The worst part wasn't losing my home. It wasn't losing my savings. It wasn't even spending the night in my car. The worst part was realizing that the people I loved most seemed relieved to see me go. Then, at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, a black luxury SUV pulled up beside me in an empty parking lot. A stranger stepped out, carrying an envelope with my name on it. What happened next forced me to question everything I thought I knew about my life. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me ask you for something small. If this story speaks to your heart, or if it truly resonates with you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city or country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. My name is William Carter. I'm 71 years old, and this was the night that changed everything I believed about family, failure, and the quiet things we leave behind in other people's lives. And the lesson I learned by the end of this story was not the one I expected. So stay with me until the end, and let me tell you how it all began. It was a cold Thursday night in Amarillo, Texas. The kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there. I remember watching my breath fog the windshield as I sat in the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store just off Interstate 40. My Ford Explorer had 193,000 miles on it. Most of my belongings were stacked in plastic bins behind the driver's seat. A framed photograph of my late wife Margaret rested face down on a blanket because I couldn't bear looking at it anymore. Not that night. Not after what had happened. 3 hours earlier, I had been standing in front of my son Ethan's house. The same house where I had spent countless weekends helping install flooring, paint walls, and build a backyard deck with my own hands. The same house I had helped them move into 8 years earlier. Rachel opened the front door before I could even knock. She crossed her arms and looked at the suitcase in my hand. "You're not staying here again, William." Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "I only need a few nights," I said. "The motel raised their rates, and I'm trying to figure some things out." She shook her head. "No, Ethan and I already talked about it." I glanced past her shoulder. My son was standing in the hallway. He looked tired, older than 42. For a second, I thought he might step forward. I thought he might say something, anything. Instead, he lowered his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, "maybe Rachel's right." Those 4 words hit harder than I expected. Maybe Rachel's right. I stood there looking at my son, trying to recognize the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during road trips. "Right about what?" I asked. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "You need stability. You need a plan." Rachel let out a short laugh. "A plan?" Williams had years to come up with a plan. Then she looked directly at me. "You're 71 years old and still expecting someone else to save you." I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Some hurts arrive too fast for words. Rachel reached behind the door and handed me a garbage bag filled with clothes. These were still in the guest room. The bag slipped from her hand and landed near my feet. Neither of them moved. Neither of them apologized. For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees in their front yard. Finally, I bent down and picked up the bag. "I understand," I said. The truth was, I didn't. Not yet. Ethan looked uncomfortable. "Dad." I waited. He never finished the sentence. Rachel stepped back into the house. "Good night, William." Then the door closed. Just like that. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just a door clicking shut. Sometimes that's all it takes to break a man's heart. Hours later, sitting in my SUV, I wrapped Margaret's old wool gloves around my hands. They still smelled faintly like cedar from the chest where she used to store winter clothes. I stared through the windshield at the empty parking lot. A shopping cart rolled slowly across the pavement in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine rumbled along the interstate. I thought about all the things I had lost over the last 6 years. Margaret, my business, my house, my retirement savings. One by one, pieces of my life had disappeared until I barely recognized what remained. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I was a failure. The thought sat with me for a long time. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. The screen showed 4:58 a.m., an unknown number. There was only one message. It read, "Please stay where you are. We've been looking for you." I frowned. Before I could respond, headlights swept across the parking lot. A black Cadillac Escalade turned slowly toward my vehicle and came to a stop beside me. A man in a dark coat stepped out carrying a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. As he approached my window, something deep inside me whispered that this was not a coincidence. And for the first time that night, I began to suspect there was a part of my story I didn't know. The man stopped beside my driver's side window and waited. He did not knock. He did not wave. He simply stood there holding the envelope as if he already knew I would eventually take it. I remember staring at him through the glass while the heater in my SUV struggled to push out lukewarm air. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then my eyes drifted back to the photograph lying face down on the passenger seat. Margaret. Even after 6 years, I still found myself looking for her whenever life stopped making sense. The strange thing about loss is that it never leaves all at once. It leaves in pieces, one holiday at a time, one empty chair at a time, one unanswered phone call at a time. Before I opened the door, before I accepted the envelope, my mind drifted somewhere else. Back to a time when none of this seemed possible. Back when my life still felt solid beneath my feet. There was a time when I believed I had built something that would last. Margaret and I were married for 41 years. We were not wealthy people. We never owned vacation homes. We never flew first class. Most years we were just trying to keep up with bills like everyone else. But we had each other. We had our son. And for a long time, that felt like enough. I started my trucking company with one used truck and a bank loan that scared me half to death. I was 32 years old. Margaret was pregnant with Ethan. I still remember sitting at our kitchen table in Amarillo, staring at paperwork while she poured coffee into a chipped blue mug. She touched my shoulder and smiled. "You are thinking too much again. I am thinking about what happens if this fails." She laughed softly. "Then we start over." That was Margaret. She never wasted energy worrying about things that had not happened yet. Over the years, the company grew slowly. One truck became 3. 3 became 8. Some years were good. Some years nearly buried us. But we kept going. Ethan grew up around diesel engines and loading docks. When he was 10, he used to ride beside me during local deliveries. He would sit there holding a clipboard much too large for him and pretend he was running the entire company. "Dad," he once said, serious as a judge, "when I grow up, I am going to make this place twice as big." I remember smiling. "I believe you will." Looking back now, that memory hurts more than I like to admit. Not because it was false, because it was real. That little boy truly loved me. Somewhere along the way, life changed him. Or maybe life revealed parts of him neither of us understood yet. Years later, when Ethan brought Rachel home for the first time, I honestly liked her. I know that might surprise you after everything that happened, but it is the truth. She arrived carrying a homemade pie and called Margaret ma'am. She asked questions. She listened. She helped clear dishes after dinner without being asked. When she and Ethan left that evening, Margaret stood at the front window watching their car disappear down the street. "She is lovely," she said. "She really is." And for a while, she was. At least that was what we believed. When Ethan proposed, Rachel cried. Margaret cried too. Even I got emotional. We welcomed her into our family completely. No hesitation, no conditions. I helped pay for the wedding. Margaret spent months helping Rachel choose decorations. Looking back, there were warning signs. Small ones. Easy to miss. Rachel always paid attention to status. She noticed who drove what, who lived where, who earned how much. At the time I brushed it aside. Plenty of people do that. It did not seem important. Then Margaret got sick. Everything changed after that. Cancer has a way of shrinking the world. Suddenly your life revolves around appointments, medications, waiting rooms, and numbers on test results. For nearly 2 years, I watched the strongest woman I had ever known fight harder than anyone should have to fight. During that time, Ethan visited less often. Rachel always had reasons. "We are busy this weekend. Work has been crazy. We already made plans." Sometimes months passed between visits. Margaret never complained. Not once. But I noticed how her eyes drifted toward the driveway every time a car slowed near the house. hoping, waiting. One afternoon, and a few months before she passed away, we were sitting on the back porch watching a summer storm roll across the Texas sky. Margaret wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and asked me a question I never forgot. "Do you think Ethan still needs us?" I looked at her. "Of course he does." She smiled sadly. "That is not what I asked." At the time, I did not understand what she meant. Now I do. Sometimes people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a chapter they already finished reading. After Margaret died, silence moved into the house like an unwanted tenant. Every room felt larger. Every meal felt smaller. I tried staying busy. I buried myself in work. Then the economy shifted. Fuel costs climbed. Contracts disappeared. Problems stacked on top of each other faster than I could solve them. Piece by piece, the life I had spent decades building began to crack. And somewhere during those years, something else was happening. Something I did not fully see. Rachel's voice was becoming louder inside my son's life, and mine was becoming quieter. Sitting there in the freezing SUV at 5 o'clock in the morning, I finally understood one painful truth. The night outside my son's house was not an isolated moment. It was the last page of a story that had been writing itself for years. And as I reached for the door handle and looked again at the envelope waiting outside, I had the uneasy feeling that whoever sent it knew something about that story that I did not. My hand rested on the door handle, but I did not open it yet. The envelope sat in the stranger's hand on the other side of the glass, waiting. Something about that moment made me hesitate. Maybe it was because the last few years had taught me that unexpected things rarely brought good news. Or maybe it was because my mind was still trapped somewhere in the past, replaying memories I had spent years trying to understand. As I sat there, another memory surfaced. One I had not thought about in a long time. Looking back now, I think that was the moment everything truly began. Not the night I ended up sleeping in my SUV. Not the moment I lost my business. It started years earlier when someone crossed a line they should never have crossed. About 18 months after Margaret passed away, I made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. The house felt too large for one person. Every room reminded me of someone who was no longer there. The silence had become its own kind of weight. So when Ethan suggested I move closer to them, I listened. "You should not be alone out there, Dad," he told me one Sunday afternoon. "You could sell the house and simplify things." Rachel smiled from across the kitchen island. "Family should stay close." Back then, I believed she meant it. I sold the house Margaret and I had lived in for nearly 3 decades. It was not an easy decision. The day I handed over the keys, I sat alone in my pickup truck for almost an hour afterward. I remember staring at the front porch where Margaret used to drink coffee every morning. Some places become part of your identity. Leaving them feels like leaving a piece of yourself behind. The sale gave me enough money to stay comfortable. Not wealthy, just comfortable. I paid off remaining debts, put money into savings, helped Ethan and Rachel refinance their mortgage. At the time, it felt good. I thought I was helping my family build something stable. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then little conversations started happening. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Rachel began asking questions about my finances. "How much did you get from the house?" she asked one evening during dinner. "Enough," I answered. She laughed lightly. "That is not a number." Ethan changed the subject. I should have noticed that, but I did not. A few weeks later, another conversation happened. We were sitting on their back patio watching the sunset. Rachel stirred her iced tea and said, "You know, money sitting in savings is basically losing value every year." I shrugged. At my age, safety matters more than growth. She exchanged a glance with Ethan. That is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people from building wealth. The words stayed with me. Not because they were rude, because of the way she said them. Like she was speaking to a child who simply did not understand the world. Over time, those conversations became more frequent. Every financial decision I made seemed to require her approval. Every choice became a debate. Every hesitation became evidence that I was somehow incapable of managing my own affairs. One afternoon, she showed up carrying a folder filled with paperwork. "What is all this?" I asked. "Investment opportunities." She placed the folder in front of me. "You should move your savings into better performing assets." I glanced through the pages. Most of it looked unfamiliar, complicated, aggressive, risky. "I am not interested." Her smile disappeared. "You did not even read it." I do not need to. You are making a mistake. Maybe. I closed the folder. But it is my mistake to make. For a second, something flashed across her face. Frustration, irritation, something colder. Then it vanished. Looking back, that was probably the first time I saw the real Rachel. Not the version she showed guests. Not the version she showed Ethan. The version that emerged whenever someone told her no. Months later, another incident happened. One that bothered me far more than I admitted at the time. Ethan invited me over for dinner. During the meal, Rachel started talking about success. She had closed a large real estate deal that week and was feeling proud of herself. She deserved to be. She had worked hard. But then the conversation shifted. People who succeed understand timing, she said. They know when to adapt. Nobody responded. She glanced at me. Some people spend their lives doing things the old way and wonder why they get left behind. The table grew quiet. Ethan stared down at his plate. I knew exactly who she was talking about. Maybe, I said carefully, or maybe success looks different to different people. Rachel smiled. That sounds nice. But numbers usually tell the truth. Nobody said anything after that. The silence lasted the rest of dinner. What hurt was not her comment. It was Ethan. He never defended me. Not once. Every time she pushed a little further, he moved a little farther away. Every time she dismissed something I had accomplished, he let it happen. Then came the day she found Margaret's memory box. I had been storing it in a closet at their house while sorting through old belongings. It contained photographs, handwritten letters, anniversary cards, and a few keepsakes that mattered only because they belonged to her. Rachel carried the box into the living room one Saturday morning. "What is this?" she asked. "My wife's things." She opened it. I immediately stood up. "Please do not go through that." She looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because it is private." Rachel lifted one of Margaret's old cards. "William, these are just old papers." Just old papers. I cannot explain why those words hurt so much. Maybe because grief attaches itself to objects other people cannot understand. Maybe because some things cannot be measured by practicality. She began sorting through the contents, evaluating them, deciding what had value and what did not. Then she picked up a faded envelope I had never noticed before. She turned it over in her hands. "What is this?" she asked. Something about the envelope caught my attention immediately. There was no stamp, no address, just handwriting on the front. My name, nothing else. Rachel frowned. Probably nothing important. She started to set it aside. But before she did, I caught a glimpse of the writing. And for reasons I still could not explain, a chill ran through me. Because I suddenly realized I had seen that handwriting somewhere before. Long before that morning. Long before Margaret died. And at that exact moment, standing in my freezing SUV years later, staring at the envelope waiting outside my window, I knew it was the same handwriting. The realization hit me so suddenly that I forgot about the cold. My hand froze halfway to the door handle as I stared at the envelope outside my window. The handwriting was not identical to the faded envelope Rachel had pulled from Margaret's memory box years earlier, but it was close enough to stir something deep inside me. The same careful slant, the same deliberate strokes, the same feeling that it belonged to a chapter of my life I had somehow misplaced. The man outside waited patiently. No pressure, no urgency, just patience. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped out into the freezing Texas air. The wind cut through my jacket immediately. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. "Yes." He handed me the envelope. "I was asked to deliver this personally." "By who?" A small smile appeared on his face. "A man who has been looking for you for a very long time." Before I could ask another question, he stepped back toward the Cadillac. Not hurried, not nervous. As though he already knew the answers mattered less than what was inside the envelope. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. 4 words were written across the top. "I never forgot you." Beneath that was a name, Daniel Brooks. For several seconds I simply stared. The name felt familiar, but distant, like a song I had not heard in years. Then another vehicle entered the parking lot. An older silver pickup truck. It pulled into a nearby space. A man stepped out wearing a heavy coat and a dark cowboy hat. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. Pastor Robert Hayes. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. "Pastor?" I called. He turned. His eyes widened immediately. "William?" He started walking toward me. Good Lord. We met beside my SUV. He looked from me to the Cadillac and back again. I heard you had been having a rough time, but I did not realize. His voice faded as his eyes drifted toward the boxes stacked inside my vehicle. I forced a smile. Life has been interesting lately. Pastor Robert shook his head slowly. No. Life has been unfair lately. The distinction surprised me. We stood there quietly for a moment. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic from Interstate 40. Then his gaze fell to the paper in my hand. What is that? I am not entirely sure. Before I could explain, another vehicle pulled into the lot. This one was a dark blue sedan. An older woman stepped out. Even from a distance, I recognized her. Linda Martinez, my former neighbor. She stared at me for half a second before hurrying over. William, she said, I thought that was your truck. She stopped when she noticed the boxes. Then her expression changed. Oh, William. I hated that look. The look people give you when they realize life has knocked you down harder than they expected. I am all right, I said. Linda folded her arms. You always say that. Pastor Robert nodded. He does. For some reason, that made all three of us laugh softly. The kind of tired laugh people share when they know the truth but choose kindness anyway. Then something unexpected happened. The driver from the Cadillac approached again. Mr. Carter, someone would like to speak with you. He extended a phone. I hesitated before taking it. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice answered. I hoped I would find you before it was too late. The voice was calm, confident, familiar in a way. I could not explain. Who is this? Daniel Brooks. I closed my eyes. The name again. Somewhere deep in my memory, something shifted. I am sorry, I admitted. I should remember you, but I do not. A soft laugh came through the phone. That does not surprise me. You helped a lot of people back then. Linda and Pastor Robert exchanged curious looks. Daniel continued. But I remember you. There was something in his voice that made me listen carefully. Respect. Gratitude. The kind that cannot be faked. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, do you remember a truck stop outside Amarillo about 14 years ago? My heart skipped. A flash of memory surfaced. Snow. Wind. Headlights. A young man sitting alone. Maybe, I said slowly. Good, Daniel replied. Because I never forgot that night. Before I could respond, another voice interrupted from nearby. Wait a second. Linda was staring at the phone. Daniel Brooks? I covered the speaker. You know the name? She looked shocked. Everyone knows that name. Pastor Robert nodded immediately. The logistics company? Linda pointed toward the phone. The one in Dallas? I looked from one face to the other. Suddenly I felt completely lost. Daniel spoke again. I can explain everything. But first I need you to understand something. The people who treated you like you were insignificant never knew who you really were. A cold chill ran through me. Not from the weather. From the certainty in his voice. What does that mean? I asked. Another brief silence followed. Then Daniel answered. It means your story did not end where they thought it did. And by sunrise, a lot of people are going to realize they made a very serious mistake. For a few seconds after Daniel's words, nobody spoke. The parking lot seemed strangely quiet. Even the wind had settled. I stood there holding the phone while Linda and Pastor Robert watched my face, trying to understand what was happening. The truth was, I did not understand it either. I think you have the wrong person, I finally said. A soft chuckle came through the phone. No, sir. That is exactly what I thought 14 years ago. I thought I had met an ordinary man at the worst moment of my life. It took me years to realize there was nothing ordinary about you. I looked down at the folded note in my hand. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. Daniel, I ran a small trucking company. That is all. That is what you did, he replied. It is not who you were. Those words stayed with me. Pastor Robert folded his arms and smiled. That sounds about right. I glanced at him. What does that mean? He looked almost surprised by the question. William, do you honestly not know how people talk about you? I stared at him blankly. He laughed softly. You really do not. Linda shook her head. He never did. I felt more confused by the second. Daniel spoke again. Tell me something. How many drivers worked for you over the years? I thought about it. Maybe 100. Maybe more. How many did you hire when nobody else would? I hesitated. I never counted. Daniel let the silence sit for a moment. Exactly. Memories began surfacing. Faces. Names. Moments I had not thought about in years. A young driver named Rick who had just completed rehab and could not find employment. A single mother named Karen who needed flexible hours to care for her son. A veteran named Mike who struggled to adjust after returning home. Back then, I never thought of those decisions as remarkable. They were simply people who needed work. Most business owners look at resumes, Daniel said. You looked at people. Pastor Robert nodded immediately. I remember Mike Reynolds. I looked over. Mike? The veteran. Pastor Robert smiled. You gave him a chance when nobody else would. Another memory surfaced, Mike sitting across from me in a worn office chair. Nervous. Exhausted. Convinced he was going to be rejected again. You have not asked about my mistakes, he had said. Everybody else does. I remembered my answer too. Your mistakes are not applying for the job. You are. At the time, it had not felt important. Now the memory seemed different somehow. Larger. Daniel's voice pulled me back. There are dozens of stories like that. Hundreds, Linda corrected quietly. We all looked at her. She shrugged. William, you never paid attention, but other people did. I leaned against the SUV. My body felt tired. My mind even more so. If that were true, why am I standing in a grocery store parking lot at 5 in the morning? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Pastor Robert stepped closer. Because good people are often the last to realize their own value. I looked away. The words made me uncomfortable. Daniel cleared his throat on the other end of the line. I need you to trust me. Trust you with what? One conversation. About what? His answer came slowly, carefully. About a decision I made years ago because of you. The Cadillac driver stood respectfully several yards away, giving us privacy. Dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. The sky had shifted from black to dark blue. The first signs of morning were appearing. Daniel, I said, I still barely remember that night. Then let me help. His voice softened. You found me sitting outside a truck stop during a snowstorm. My car was dead. My bank account was empty. I had lost my job 3 weeks earlier. I had nowhere left to go. Something inside me stirred. The image became clearer. Snow collecting on a windshield. A young man sitting alone with both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. You bought me dinner, Daniel continued. Then breakfast. Then you spent 2 hours helping me call people who might hire me. More pieces returned. Fragments. Glimpses. You gave me a list of names, I said slowly. I remember writing down names. You did. His voice cracked slightly. You also gave me something else. I frowned. What? A long pause followed. When Daniel spoke again, his words carried a weight I could feel even through the phone. Hope. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even Linda lowered her eyes. Mr. Carter, Daniel continued, that was the first time in months somebody treated me like my future still mattered. I swallowed hard. I was just trying to help. Exactly. His answer came immediately. That is the part you never understood. You always thought you were just helping. The horizon continued to brighten. A few early commuters pulled into the parking lot. None of them knew that my entire understanding of my own life was quietly shifting. Then Daniel said something that made my heart stop. The board meeting starts in 4 hours. I blinked. What board meeting? Mine. I heard movement on the other end. Papers, voices in the background. And before it begins, there are several people who want to meet the man responsible for why I am still here. I looked down at the note again. I never forgot you. For the first time, I began to suspect that the envelope, the Cadillac, and the phone call were only the beginning. And somewhere beyond the rising Texas sun, pieces of a story I had never fully understood were finally starting to come together. By 6:30 that morning, the sun had finally climbed above the horizon. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt quite as heavy. Maybe because something else had taken its place. Not hope exactly. More like curiosity. The kind that keeps you moving when your heart is too tired to believe in miracles. Pastor Robert insisted on buying breakfast. We ended up at a small diner a few miles away. The kind with cracked vinyl booths, endless coffee refills, and waitresses who called everyone honey. Linda sat across from me. Pastor Robert sat beside her. The envelope remained folded inside my jacket pocket. Every few minutes I found myself touching it, just to make sure it was real. You should call Ethan, Linda said carefully as she stirred cream into her coffee. I looked out the window. Why? Because eventually he is going to hear about this. I smiled faintly. Hear about what? I still do not know what this is. Pastor Robert leaned back. I think you know more than you realize. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Ethan. The name appeared on the screen. For a moment nobody spoke. I stared at it. Then I answered. Hello? His voice came quickly. Too quickly. Dad. Where are you? The question surprised me. Why? A pause. Rachel said she saw a luxury SUV near your truck this morning. I looked at Pastor Robert. He raised an eyebrow. And? I asked. And we are trying to understand what is going on. There was something different in Ethan's voice. Uneasiness. Confusion. Maybe even concern. It had been a long time since I had heard any of those. I am having breakfast, I said. With who? Friends. Another silence. Then Rachel's voice appeared faintly in the background. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. Ask him who owns the vehicle. Ask him where he got the money. Ask him what he is hiding. I closed my eyes. Same pattern, different day. Ethan cleared his throat. Dad, Rachel is worried. For some reason that made Linda laugh out loud. Not a cruel laugh, just an honest one. Ethan heard it through the phone. Who is that? Linda Martinez. Another pause. Then Pastor Robert leaned closer. Tell him I am here too. I did. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Pastor Robert? Ethan finally said. Yes. What is happening? The old pastor looked out the diner window before answering. I think your father is finally being seen by people who never forgot what he did for them. More silence. Then Rachel's voice returned in the background. Sharper this time. Faster. The words blended together, but the tone was unmistakable. Defensive. Nervous. This is ridiculous, she said loudly enough for all of us to hear. People do not send luxury cars because somebody was nice 20 years ago. I did not respond. Neither did Pastor Robert. Ethan sounded tired. Dad, can we meet later? I thought about it. If you want. I do. Then we will talk. We ended the call. Linda slowly set down her coffee cup. She sounds worried. Why? I asked. Linda gave me a look that felt almost maternal. Because people who spend years deciding someone has no value become very uncomfortable when the world disagrees with them. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. How soon can you get to Dallas? He asked. I nearly laughed. Daniel? I slept in a grocery store parking lot. Dallas was not exactly on my schedule. He laughed too. Fair point. Then his voice softened. The offer still stands. What offer? Come meet the people whose lives you changed. I looked down at the table. I did not change anybody's life. That is where you are wrong. His answer came immediately. You just never stayed around long enough to see the results. An hour later, word had somehow begun spreading. Not through newspapers. Not through television. Through people. Old employees. Former drivers. Friends of friends. A man named Rick called me. Then Karen. Then Mike Reynolds. Each conversation left me more stunned than the last. Mike was the one that hit hardest. Mr. Carter, he said, I have wanted to thank you for years. For what? I asked. He laughed softly. You gave me a job when nobody trusted me. You earned that job. Maybe. His voice grew quiet. But you gave me a chance to earn it. After we hung up, I sat alone in the diner booth for several minutes. Outside, the morning traffic moved steadily through Amarillo. People headed to work, running errands, living ordinary lives. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Not around me. Inside me. For years I had accepted Rachel's version of events. Not completely, but enough. Enough to wonder if maybe my life had amounted to less than I hoped. Enough to question my own worth after losing my business. Enough to believe failure had somehow erased everything that came before it. Now, for the first time, I was hearing another version. Not from strangers. From people who had actually been there. People who remembered details I had forgotten. People who remembered kindnesses I never considered important. By noon, Ethan called again. His voice sounded different this time. More serious. Dad. Yes? Rachel thinks there has to be another explanation. I smiled sadly. For what? He hesitated. Then he said something I never expected to hear. For why so many people keep calling you. I looked through the diner window at the bright Texas sky. Maybe there is no explanation, son. What do you mean? I thought about Daniel, about Mike, about Karen, about the dozens of names resurfacing from years I had nearly forgotten. Then I answered as honestly as I could. Maybe people simply remember who was there when they needed somebody. And for the first time since this strange day had begun, Ethan had absolutely nothing to say. That afternoon, I finally left the diner. Pastor Robert drove back to the church. Linda headed home. I remained in Amarillo, sitting in my SUV beneath a cloudless Texas sky, trying to process everything that had happened in less than 12 hours. My phone had become strangely busy. Messages, missed calls, voicemails. People whose names I had not heard in years were suddenly reaching out. Some wanted to reconnect. Some wanted to thank me. Some simply wanted to know if the stories they had heard were true. The strange part was that I still did not feel important. I felt tired, confused, grateful, but not important. Around 3 o'clock, Ethan called again. This time I answered immediately. "Hey, son." He sounded distracted. "Dad, where are you?" "Still in Amarillo." A long pause followed. Then he sighed heavily. "Things are getting weird over here." I leaned back in my seat. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then I heard Rachel's voice somewhere in the background. Not clear enough to make out every word. Clear enough to hear frustration. "Because people keep calling," Ethan finally said. "Who?" "Friends? Neighbors? People from town." I frowned. "Why?" Ethan laughed nervously. "Apparently half of Amarillo knows someone who worked for you." I said nothing. He continued. "Rachel thought somebody was exaggerating. Then Linda posted something online." I blinked. "Linda posted what?" "Just a picture." His voice grew quieter. "A picture of you and Mom from years ago." I looked out through the windshield. Margaret's photograph was still beside me. What did she write? Ethan hesitated. "She wrote that good people should never be forgotten simply because life gets hard." I closed my eyes. Linda always did have a way with words. Ethan sighed again. Then people started commenting. And, "Dad." There are hundreds of comments. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said something unexpected. "I did not know." "Did not know what?" His answer came softly. "How many people respected you?" Before I could respond, Rachel's voice suddenly grew louder. This time I could hear every word. "Respected him for what?" she snapped. "Being nice?" Ethan lowered the phone, but not enough. Her voice carried through clearly. "Nobody builds a successful company because somebody bought them dinner once." I heard Ethan exhale sharply. "Rachel. No. Seriously. This is ridiculous." Her frustration was obvious now. "Everybody is acting like he cured cancer." I remained silent, not because I was angry, because something else had caught my attention. Ethan sounded uncomfortable, not defensive, uncomfortable. The difference mattered. "Rachel," he said quietly, "can you stop?" The line went silent. I had not heard him say those words to her in years. Then came another voice. A woman's voice. Older. Familiar. My stomach tightened. "Ethan?" she said. "You should listen to yourself." "Aunt Carol?" Ethan sounded surprised. Aunt Carol was Margaret's older sister, 80 years old, stubborn as a Texas oak tree. Apparently, she was visiting. "Your father spent 40 years helping people," she said. "Your mother used to tell me stories." Rachel laughed sarcastically. Of course she did. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. "Young lady," Aunt Carol said calmly, "you seem to know the price of everything and the value of nothing." Complete silence followed. I nearly smiled. Even at 80, Carol could stop a room cold. Ethan muttered something I could not hear. Rachel immediately responded. Their voices began overlapping, talking over one another, defending themselves, correcting each other. For the first time, they were not standing together. They were standing opposite each other. I listened quietly, not saying a word. Rachel insisted she had only wanted what was best for everyone. Ethan argued that certain comments had gone too far. Rachel blamed misunderstandings. Ethan blamed assumptions. Every sentence revealed another crack. Every explanation sounded weaker than the one before. Then came the moment that surprised me most. "You agreed with me," Rachel snapped. "Every single time." Ethan did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. "Maybe I should not have." The silence afterwards seemed endless. Rachel spoke first. So now this is my fault? I did not say that. That is exactly what you are saying. No, I am saying we were wrong. Another long pause followed. Then Rachel laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she did not know what else to do. This is unbelievable. She lowered her voice. One phone call from some rich executive and suddenly everybody acts like your father is a saint. Ethan responded immediately. That is not what this is about. Then what is it about? His answer arrived so quietly I almost missed it. Maybe it is about realizing I stopped paying attention. Those words hung in the air. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. Even Rachel seemed unsure how to respond. For years she had controlled the narrative. For years she had decided what mattered and what did not. Now other voices were entering the conversation. Voices she could not control. Memories she could not rewrite. People she could not dismiss. And the more she pushed back, the worse it seemed to become. That evening another message arrived from Daniel. It contained only one sentence. Tomorrow morning, Dallas. There are people waiting to meet you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then my phone rang one final time before sunset. Ethan again. His voice sounded different now. Quieter, older somehow. Dad? Yes? I have been thinking about something all day. I waited. When was the last time anybody thanked you? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at my hands. Hands that had spent decades loading freight, fixing engines, signing paychecks, and holding together a life that no longer existed. Then I answered honestly, I do not remember. Another silence followed. Then Ethan whispered something that sounded more painful than any argument. I think that might be part of the problem. And for the first time since everything began, I realized the people unraveling were not the ones who had been forgotten. They were the ones finally being forced to remember. The next morning, I pointed my old SUV south and started the drive to Dallas. For the first time in a very long while, I was not driving toward a problem. I was driving toward an answer. The Texas landscape rolled past my windshield in long stretches of open highway and pale winter sunlight. The boxes containing what remained of my belongings sat quietly behind me. Margaret's photograph rested in the passenger seat. Every so often, I glanced at it. Not because I was sad, not because I was lonely, but because for the first time in years, I wished she could see what was happening. She would have understood it long before I did. Margaret always understood people better than I understood myself. About halfway to Dallas, I stopped at a small gas station outside Wichita Falls. While filling the tank, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Just 6 words. Drive safe. Let me know. I stared at the screen for a few moments. There was no argument, no explanation, no defense. Just 6 simple words. Strange how sometimes the smallest things carry the most weight. I typed back, I will. Then I put the phone away and continued south. By early afternoon, Dallas appeared on the horizon. Glass towers. Traffic. Endless movement. A different world from Amarillo. Daniel had sent an address earlier that morning. The GPS guided me toward a modern office building overlooking a small lake. When I arrived, I sat in the parking lot for a moment, looking at the building. It was larger than anything I had ever owned. More impressive than any place I had ever worked. Part of me wondered if I belonged there at all. Then my phone rang. You made it, Daniel said. I am here. Good. His voice sounded warm, relieved. Come inside. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened onto the top floor. Daniel was waiting. The moment I saw him, the years disappeared. Not physically. He was older now. More polished. More confident. But his eyes were the same. The eyes of the young man sitting alone during a snowstorm all those years ago. Before I could say anything, he stepped forward and hugged me. No hesitation, no awkwardness. Just gratitude, real gratitude. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. I did not know how to respond, so I simply nodded. Daniel guided me through the office. People smiled. Some nodded respectfully. Others shook my hand. A few knew my name before I introduced myself. That still felt strange. Eventually, we entered a conference room overlooking the city. Several people were already there. Men and women of different ages, different backgrounds, different careers. At first, I thought they were business associates. Then Daniel began introducing them. This is Karen. The woman stood and smiled. I recognized her name immediately. You gave me flexible hours when my son was recovering from surgery, she said. Nobody else would. My throat tightened. Another man stood. Mike Reynolds. We shook hands. You hired me when I came home and could not find work. Then another person, and another, and another. Each carried a story, a memory, a moment I barely remembered, a kindness I had long ago forgotten. Yet somehow they had not forgotten. The room was not filled with successful executives. It was filled with people, real people, parents, workers, veterans, business owners, teachers, people whose lives had moved forward, people who had built families and careers and futures. And somehow, in small ways, I had been part of those stories. Daniel waited until everyone finished speaking. Then he looked at me and smiled. Do you understand now? I slowly shook my head. Not completely. He laughed. Good. Because neither do I. Everyone smiled. The tension disappeared. For the next 2 hours we talked. Not about money, not about status, not about success. We talked about life, mistakes, lessons, family, regret, gratitude. The things that actually matter once enough years have passed. At one point, Daniel asked a question. What kept you going all those years? I looked out the window toward the city below. Honestly, yes. I thought about Margaret, about Ethan as a boy, about long nights on the road, about payroll deadlines and broken engines and hospital waiting rooms. Then I answered. People were depending on me. The room grew quiet. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned it. Because they understood. Late that afternoon, I stepped outside onto a terrace overlooking the lake. The wind was gentler here than it had been in Amarillo. The water reflected the fading sunlight. For the first time in years, I felt completely still inside. Not victorious, not vindicated, just peaceful. A few moments later, Daniel joined me. Neither of us spoke right away. Finally, he said, You know, I spent years trying to find a way to repay you. I smiled. You do not owe me anything. I know. He looked out across the water. That is why it took me so long to understand. This was never about repayment. Then what is it about? He thought for a moment before answering. Legacy. I looked at him. He continued. Most people think legacy is something you leave behind after you die. I think it is something you build every day without realizing it. We stood there in silence, watching the sunlight fade across the lake. Somewhere back in Amarillo, people were still arguing about who was right and who was wrong. Somewhere, Rachel was probably still searching for explanations. Somewhere, Ethan was wrestling with memories he could no longer ignore. But standing there beside Daniel, I realized something important. I was no longer living inside that conflict. I was no longer measuring my worth through someone else's opinion. The fight was over for me. What remained was simpler. The people who stayed. The people who remembered. The people who showed up. And for the first time in many years, that felt like more than enough. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like I imagined it would on that cold morning in Amarillo. Not because I had become wealthy, not because I had somehow won a battle. The truth was much simpler than that. I had finally stopped measuring my life by what I had lost and started seeing it through the people I had helped, the relationships I had built, and the values I had carried with me when everything else disappeared. Daniel convinced me to stay in Dallas for a while. What began as a short visit turned into something more permanent. I rented a modest apartment overlooking a small park on the edge of the city. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet place with sunlight in the mornings and enough room for the few things that still mattered to me. Margaret's photograph sat beside the window. Her favorite quilt rested across the back of the couch. The old memory box occupied a shelf in the living room. For the first time in years, those objects no longer felt like reminders of what I had lost. They felt like proof of what I had been fortunate enough to have. A few mornings each week, I visited Daniel's office. Not as an executive, not as a consultant with a fancy title. I simply met with younger employees who wanted advice. We talked about work, family, failure, responsibility. Sometimes they asked about leadership. Sometimes they asked about life. I always told them the same thing. People remember how you treat them long after they forget what you achieved. That lesson seemed to matter more now than it ever had before. As for Ethan, our relationship changed slowly. Real healing usually does. It does not arrive in a dramatic speech or a perfect apology. It arrives in small moments, repeated consistently over time. Phone calls became more frequent. Then visits, then conversations that lasted longer than a few minutes. One Saturday morning, he drove to Dallas and asked if I wanted breakfast. We ended up sitting in a small diner not far from the lake. Funny how life circles back sometimes. He spent most of the meal staring into his coffee. Finally, he looked up. "Dad, I have replayed the last few years 1,000 times." I remained quiet. He shook his head. "I keep asking myself when I stopped paying attention." There was no anger left in his voice. Only regret, real regret. "You were building your own life," I said. "That is part of what parents want." He swallowed hard. "Not like that." We sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something that told me he had finally understood. "I spent so much time listening to opinions that I stopped seeing the person standing right in front of me." I nodded. Sometimes the truth does not need an argument. It only needs room to exist. Rachel's story unfolded differently. There was no dramatic downfall, no public humiliation, no revenge. Life rarely works that way. Instead, consequences arrived quietly. Relationships became strained. Friends who once agreed with everything she said began keeping their distance. Family gatherings grew uncomfortable. The problem was not that people hated her. The problem was that people no longer trusted her judgment. Respect is difficult to earn and surprisingly easy to lose. Last I heard, she and Ethan were attending counseling. Whether their marriage survived was not my decision to make. Some lessons belong to other people. Some journeys must be walked alone. I wish them both peace. Truly. Carrying bitterness would have only kept me trapped in a chapter that was already over. One evening, near the end of summer, Daniel and I sat beside the lake watching the sun disappear behind the skyline. The water reflected shades of gold and orange. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. "You know, I spent years thinking I owed you something." I laughed softly. "And I spent years thinking I had nothing left to offer." He looked at me. Turns out we were both wrong. That conversation stayed with me. Because by then I finally understood what he meant. Legacy is not money. It is not property. It is not status. Legacy is what remains in other people after you leave the room. It is the encouragement you give when someone feels invisible. It is the kindness you offer when there is no reward waiting for you. It is the belief you place in someone long before they learn how to believe in themselves. Those things travel farther than we ever realize. If you are listening to my story right now and carrying a similar wound, I want you to hear this from someone who once sat alone believing he had reached the end. Do not let another person's opinion become the measure of your worth. Do not hand that responsibility to a spouse, a child, a friend, a boss, or anyone else. People are imperfect. They get distracted. They make mistakes. Sometimes they fail to see the value standing right in front of them. That does not mean your value disappeared. It only means they failed to recognize it. Protect your dignity. Protect your peace. Protect the parts of yourself that remain true even when life becomes difficult. And if you have ever felt forgotten, please remember this. The seeds you plant in other people's lives often grow where you cannot see them. Years may pass before you understand the impact you had. But that does not mean the impact was not there. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear where you are listening from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Sometimes the stories we share help someone else feel a little less alone. The core lesson I carried away from all of this is simple. Never allow temporary hardship to convince you that your life had no lasting value. A few weeks ago, I took a drive just before sunrise. No destination, no schedule, just an open road and a quiet morning. As the first light appeared across the horizon, I reached over and picked up Margaret's old wool gloves from the passenger seat. The same gloves that had been beside me on one of the hardest nights of my life. I held them for a moment, smiled, and placed them back down. Then I kept driving toward the sunrise. Because some chapters end when we lose everything, and some begin the moment we finally understand what was never lost at all. Thank you for spending this time with me and walking beside me through a story about family, mistakes, forgiveness, and second chances. Wherever you are today, I hope you find the courage to trust your own worth, the wisdom to protect your peace, and the strength to keep moving forward. Until we meet again in another story, take care of yourself and the people who truly see you.